One of the strangest things I have seen in all my years around money is how often people work very hard to save small amounts in the wrong places and then lose very large amounts in the places that matter. They will drive 20 minutes across town to save $10 on groceries. They will stand in a store comparing two nearly identical products as if the future of the republic depends on the cheaper bottle. They will spend an hour looking for a coupon, another hour reading reviews about the cheapest possible version of something, and then later make a careless decision that quietly cost them $10,000 or $50,000 or 10 years. That is not thrift, that is confusion. I have nothing against saving money. I have spent my whole life telling people that discipline matters, that waste matters, that leakage matters, that small habits become large outcomes. I believe all of that very strongly. But there is a great difference between being cheap and being wise. A cheap person focuses only on the dollar leaving his hand. A wise person asks what that dollar is buying in return. That difference changes everything. The world trains people badly on this subject. It teaches them that the path to wealth is simply spending less. Cheaper food, cheaper tools, cheaper advice, cheaper experiences, cheaper decisions, cheaper everything, save every dollar, no matter what it costs you in time, energy, learning, or future earning power. That is not intelligent finance. That is mechanical deprivation. And mechanical deprivation often turns into a much more expensive life later on because the person saved in places where investment was needed and spent in places where value was absent. The goal of money was never to spend the least. The goal is to spend with judgment. Money is a tool. It is not a scorecard by itself, and it is not a religion. Its value depends entirely on what it helps you build, avoid, protect, accelerate, or enjoy. A dollar saved stupidly can be as destructive as a dollar spent stupidly. I have watched both happen when I was younger. I used to think the hard part of money was simply getting more of it. That is what most young people believe: earn more, and life becomes easier. In one sense, that is true. Income matters. A higher earning power makes almost every financial problem easier to solve. But over time, I learned a more useful lesson. The real difficulty is not earning. It is allocation. The truly wealthy person is often not the one making the most noise about money. It is the person who has learned which expenditures are actually investments in disguise, which are protective decisions, which create compounding value, which create irreplaceable life, and which are merely vanity dressed up like necessity. I have seen men earn fortunes and waste them because they mistook price for value. I have seen men of modest means quietly build strong lives because they understood that some things are worth paying for and some are not worth a penny more than necessary. So if you ask me after all these years, where I would never again try to save money merely for the pleasure of seeing a lower number, I would give you 7 answers. Not 7 luxury categories, not 7 excuses for spending. 7 areas where cheapness often becomes one of the most expensive habits a person can have. The first is knowledge. People find this one awkward because the modern world has filled itself with free information, and free information makes people feel clever before it makes them effective. They watch a few videos, read a few threads, listen to somebody with a microphone and a large opinion, and suddenly they feel they have avoided paying for learning. Sometimes they have; more often they have paid with something much more valuable than money. They have paid with time. Time is the highest priced currency you will ever use, because you never get a refund. A dollar can be earned again. An hour used badly is gone permanently. I think of all the people who spend years circling around a skill that could have been learned far faster with proper instruction. A person wants to learn a language, or accounting, or sales, or software, or investing, or negotiation, or some form of specialized work that could materially improve his income. He bounces from one free source to another. One app, another article, another random video, half a course here, half a podcast there. He tells himself he is being economical. Often he is just being slow. Now, I have no prejudice against free information. I built much of my own mind in libraries. I read annual reports that cost me nothing. I consumed ordinary materials with a hunger that had very little to do with price and everything to do with usefulness. Free can be wonderful if the material is excellent and if you know how to use it. But what most people call free learning is not organized learning. It is wandering. And wandering is expensive. Imagine you want to learn Spanish. You can spend years grazing through disconnected lessons, random phrases, abandoned practice sessions, and kitchen table videos filmed by somebody with good intentions and poor structure. You may eventually get there. But what did the path really cost? If a good teacher, a real course, or a structured program could have compressed 3 years into 6 months, then the question is not whether the paid instruction cost $500. The question is what those missing 2.5 years were worth. The same as a person can spend years making avoidable mistakes in marketing, selling, hiring, investing, or tax planning because he was too proud or too frightened to pay for proper knowledge. Then one day he pays someone who knows what they are doing, and in an hour or two the fog lifts. Suddenly a better path appears. He says, "I wish I had known this earlier." That sentence is usually a receipt. I knew a young man once who wanted to build an online service business. He was talented enough, energetic enough, and serious enough to succeed. But he had become almost ideologically committed to learning everything for free. He would read fragments, watch tutorials, try 10 versions of the same idea, quit, start again, and continually confuse activity with progress. He thought paying for a serious mentor or structured course was indulgent. What he did not calculate was the opportunity cost of 2 years spent crawling toward what one good system could have taught him in months. Eventually, he paid for focused instruction. It stung him emotionally because the price was visible, but within a relatively short period, his income rose dramatically because the confusion ended. He did not become a genius overnight. He simply stopped paying for his education in the slowest, most expensive way possible. If spending a few $100s or a few $1,000s helps you gain a skill that earns $10,000, $20,000, or $50,000 more every year, that is not an expense in any sensible economic language. That is capital allocation. The strangest thing is that people who will hesitate to spend on upgrading their mind will happily overspend on objects that depreciate the minute they touch them. They will borrow for appearance but haggle with knowledge. That is upside down. The most valuable asset you will ever own sits between your ears. Everything else depends on how well that asset is trained, disciplined, and fed. The second thing I stopped wanting to be cheap about is milestone memories. This makes some very disciplined people uncomfortable because they think every useful financial conversation should sound like a war against joy. That is childish. Money is not the point. It is a tool. And one of the things it can properly purchase is a meaningful life. I do not mean reckless living. I do not mean spending like a fool every time emotion rises. I mean understanding that some moments do not repeat, and trying to squeeze every dollar out of them often squeezes out the very meaning you were supposed to preserve. I have noticed something over the years when people look back over a long life. They almost never tell the stories the spreadsheet would have predicted. No one glows with nostalgia about the Tuesday they bought the cheaper detergent. Nobody tears up remembering the glorious season when they found the lowest cost generic aluminum foil. What they remember are the rooms where people they loved were together. A wedding, a milestone birthday, a graduation, a reunion, a family trip that happened at exactly the right age, before the grandparents got slower, before the children grew indifferent, before the health issue, before the divorce, before the relocation, before time moved 1 inch further than it already had. These moments matter because life does not offer unlimited inventory in those categories. Money can be earned again, a market can recover again, an opportunity can return. A significant human moment often happens exactly once. The language of prudent people sometimes becomes too narrow here. They begin treating all expenditures alike because they are so proud of discipline that they forget to distinguish between waste and meaning. That is a mistake. If you spend foolishly on a wedding merely to impress people, that is vanity. If you spend thoughtfully to gather the people who matter most and mark a moment that will never exist again in quite the same form, that is different. I remember a family who nearly destroyed the joy of a daughter's wedding because they became so obsessed with shaving every possible dollar that the planning process itself became mean. They were not protecting the family, they were turning the occasion into an argument. The obsession with saving had exceeded the purpose of the event. Again, I am not arguing for extravagance. I am arguing for proportion. There is a great difference between intelligent budgeting and accidentally draining the life out of a once-in-a-lifetime moment, because the number on the page became more important than the people in the room. A man can save a little extra on the ceremony and lose the memory. That is not a bargain. The same is true with birthdays, reunions, or other rare gatherings. Not every dinner deserves a lavish budget. Not every holiday deserves financial theater. But once in a while, a life presents you with a chance to gather the right people in the same place at the same time. And if you are wise, you notice the rarity. You do not behave like a lunatic. You behave like an adult who understands that some expenditures cannot be judged by the same logic as paper towels. Money exists partly to protect, partly to build, and partly to honor what matters. If it cannot do the third thing as well, then you may end up with a neat balance sheet and a very underlived life. The third area where I learned never to be cheap is health. This one should be obvious, and yet people behave as though it were optional. If I gave you a car and told you it would be the only car you would own for the rest of your life, no trade-ins, no replacements, no upgrades, no second chance, you would treat that car with almost absurd seriousness. You would change the oil. You would pay attention to odd noises. You would not ignore basic maintenance because saving a few dollars this month felt clever. Why? Because once you fully understood the scarcity of the asset, cheapness would stop looking intelligent. The body operates under a harsher rule than the car. You get one. And yet people save money here in the strangest and dumbest ways. They buy food that harms them because it is slightly cheaper. They skip checkups because nothing feels urgently wrong yet. They treat sleep like a negotiable hobby. They behave as though exercise were cosmetic rather than structural. Then they become surprised when energy falls, thinking dulls, mood worsens, focus deteriorates, and medical bills later arrive with the enthusiasm of compounded neglect. Health is not only about living longer, it is about keeping the machine that earns every dollar, thinks every thought, and experiences every relationship in functional condition. If your sleep is poor, your judgment worsens. If your food is poor, your energy becomes unstable. If your body does not move, your mind often becomes heavier too. The public likes dramatic solutions. Most of health is not dramatic. Sleep, nutrition, and movement are not glamorous subjects, and that is precisely why they are so often neglected. They sound too ordinary to be powerful. They are enormously powerful. I have seen people spend thousands upgrading a car they drive an hour a day while refusing to spend a fraction of that on improving the body they live in all day, every day. That is a curious hierarchy. A gym membership you actually use is not an indulgence. Good food is not an indulgence. Preventive care is not an indulgence. Dental care is not an indulgence. Proper vision, proper treatment, proper maintenance of the one physical system through which all your work, all your thought, and all your enjoyment of life must pass. That is not spending. That is preserving the productive asset from which everything else depends. There is another hidden return here. A healthy person is often more productive, more patient, more emotionally stable, and more economically capable than an unhealthy one. Better sleep alone has a return profile most investors would envy if it were packaged like a financial product. Better focus, better decisions, better energy. Fewer stupid purchases made from stress or exhaustion. Better work, better relationships, better resilience. That is a remarkable set of dividends from something so unglamorous. Yet people try to save the wrong money here all the time. They save on food quality and pay later in weakness. They save on checkups and pay later in treatment. They save on maintenance and later act shocked when the neglected problem became expensive. That is not thrift, it is deferred billing. The fourth thing I learned not to be cheap about is the tools I use to do my work. This is an area where people often confuse scrappiness with wisdom. In the beginning, being scrappy is fine. It may even be necessary. I have no issue with starting small, using what you have, improvising, learning fundamentals without fancy gear, and refusing to hide incompetence behind expensive equipment. That is sensible. But there comes a point where cheap tools stop teaching you resilience and start taxing your output. That is an entirely different situation. I have seen it in writers working on miserable computers that freeze every few minutes, in creators using microphones that make everything sound like a kitchen appliance, in business owners using software so poor that their own systems sabotage their time, in workers using equipment that turns every simple task into a long irritation. They tell themselves they are saving money. Again, they are usually paying with time, and friction. A good tool does not guarantee success, but a bad tool can impose steady failure. If a better computer saves you an hour a day, how much is that worth over a year? If a better microphone lets your work sound credible enough to attract better business, how much is that worth? If software that costs a little more eliminates constant confusion, duplicated effort, or costly errors, what exactly did you save by avoiding it? I have always liked businesses with productive assets, because productive assets create returns over time. A good tool is often a productive asset at the personal level. It is not simply a purchase, it is capacity, it removes friction, It allows skill to translate into output more cleanly. It protects attention. People underestimate the value of reduced friction. A man can be talented and still waste enormous chunks of his life fighting his own equipment. If the machine is slow, the process breaks. If the process breaks, concentration breaks. If concentration breaks, output falls. Then the person says he lacks time or momentum. Often he lacks proper tools. Again, I am not advocating consumer foolishness. Buying expensive things to flatter yourself is different from buying better tools because they make productive work materially faster, better, or more reliable. The key question is simple. Does this tool directly improve output speed or quality enough to justify the cost? If the answer is yes, I knew a young photographer once who insisted on using old bargain equipment long after his skill had outgrown it. He liked telling himself he was being disciplined. In reality, he was losing clients because his output quality and reliability were being limited by tools that no longer matched the level at which he wanted to compete. Once he finally upgraded, he did not become an artist overnight. He simply removed the unnecessary drag that had been handicapping him for years. That is what a proper tool does. It removes needless resistance between competence and result. The fifth thing I have learned not to be cheap about is safety and security. This is another category people neglect because it is not entertaining. No one likes paying for insurance. No one wakes up excited to buy a better lock, a safer storage system, a stronger security setup, or a little more protection than feels immediately necessary. That is why these things are usually underappreciated. But if you understand investing, you already understand the principle, protect the downside. You can do a lot of things right for a long time and still have one badly unprotected event. Wipe out years of progress. That is why safety is not a luxury. It is risk management. The strange thing about protection is that when it works, it feels like wasted money. Nothing happened, so people say, why did I pay for that? That is the same logic that causes people to skip insurance until the day they need it and then curse themselves for confusing a quiet year with a permanent condition. Homeowners insurance, health coverage, umbrella protection, proper security for valuable items, a safe deposit box if appropriate, a real safe, if the circumstances justify it, backup systems, digital security, whatever the area is, you are not paying for excitement. You are paying to reduce the damage of bad days. That is an intelligent use of money. I once knew a man who had spent years building a respectable life and a respectable balance sheet, only to lose a meaningful part of his confidence because one event that could have been largely covered and contained instead became a major wound. Not because he was unlucky by some unusual standard, because he had treated protection as the easiest category to cheap out on. After all, nothing had gone wrong for years. He thought that history was evidence. It was merely an interval. One bad day can erase 10 good years if the structure is sloppy enough. That is what protection exists to prevent. People who are proud of every dollar they save by skipping insurance or ignoring security are often like the man who brags about saving money by refusing to install brakes on the car. The savings look clever right up until the point they do not. And here is another useful thought. Security is often very cheap compared with regret. A few $100s for proper storage, proper coverage, better digital safeguards, stronger physical protection, or better liability coverage can look unnecessary when you compare it only to the present. Compare it instead to loss, disruption, emotional damage, legal trouble, or years of work erased in one ugly sequence. Then the arithmetic becomes much more honest. The sixth thing I have learned not to be cheap about is professionals. This subject irritates people because it wounds the ego. Everyone wants to believe he can handle everything. There is a childish pride in saying, I do it all myself. Sometimes that pride is admirable. Often it is expensive. The most useful concept here is one Charlie, and I value deeply. Stay inside your circle of competence. That does not mean stay stupid. It means understand the border between what you know well enough to act on and what you only know well enough to sound confident about at dinner. That border matters. Most financial errors of consequence occur after a person crosses it carelessly. Law is full of it. Taxes are full of it. Contracts are full of it. Estate planning is full of it. Business structuring is full of it. There are areas of life where small details are not small at all. One missed clause, one misunderstood tax election, one sloppy trust structure, one improperly reviewed agreement, one overlooked liability issue, one incorrect filing assumption, and the cost can be far larger than the price of competent advice would have been. A good tax advisor who understands your actual situation can save you astonishing sums, not through trickery, but through competence. A good lawyer can prevent pain you will never see coming by yourself. A good accountant can organize confusion into clarity before the confusion becomes expensive. That is not indulgence. That is rent paid to expertise instead of tuition paid to mistakes. I once watched a man argue passionately against paying for tax advice because the fee felt visible and offensive to him. Later, he made a preventable tax error that cost multiples of the advisory fee he had resisted so proudly. That is a perfect illustration of how people make themselves poorer by trying to avoid professional cost in the wrong places. Of course, you do not hire a specialist for every tiny decision in life. That would be foolish too. But when the stakes are meaningful and the terrain is clearly outside your competence, good professional advice is often one of the highest return purchases available. The real issue is not whether the fee hurts. The issue is what mistake it may prevent. I have always believed that a great professional is cheaper than a great mistake. That is how adults should think. The final thing I learned not to be cheap about is retirement investing. This one is perhaps the most painful because the cost of cheapness hides so well in the beginning. When people are young, compounding feels abstract. It is a concept, not a force. A person says he will invest later because later feels available in almost unlimited supply. A nicer apartment today feels real. A better car today feels real. Another trip, another upgrade, another phase of spending. Those all feel immediate and visible. Retirement, by contrast, feels like a distant mathematical rumor. That is why people postpone it. Not because they are evil, because the human brain discounts distant benefits very badly. But if you understand investing at all, you understand that time is not a minor ingredient here. It is the main engine. Time in the market beats timing the market, not because slogans are comforting, but because compounding does most of its impressive work in the later years. The early years look modest. That is what fools people. They see slow visible progress and think they can always begin later, make larger contributions, and somehow catch up without penalty. They rarely calculate what they are really giving away. Each year of delay is not merely 1 year of missing contributions. It is one less year for the whole future stack of returns to build on itself. That is why the person who starts early with modest amounts often ends up ahead of the person who starts later with larger amounts. The difference is not effort. The difference is time. Time is the one asset no one can refinance. You cannot borrow more 20s once your 20s are gone. You cannot repurchase the untouched decades that would have allowed compounding to do its finest work. That is why trying to save money by not investing for retirement early enough is one of the most expensive forms of false economy I know. People tell themselves they are being practical. They are often making a massively leveraged bet against the calendar. That is a bad trade. The earlier you begin, the less heroism the system requires later. The later you begin, the more painful the arithmetic becomes. Suddenly the required savings rate is higher. The margin for market disappointment is smaller. The sense of urgency gets sharper. You are no longer merely investing. You are trying to make up for lost compounding years, and the market does not care about your regret. It only works with the time you left it. I have always preferred beginning early, even imperfectly, to beginning late with grand intentions. The first automatic contribution matters more than the perfect one. The first decade matters more than the best spreadsheet. A person who starts, continues, and lets time help him is doing something much more intelligent than a person who keeps waiting for the emotionally perfect moment to get serious. Because that perfect moment never comes. Life will always produce some reason to spend now. Retirement investing requires a person to honor a future version of himself who cannot yet argue back very loudly. That takes maturity, and maturity is often what the market rewards most over very long stretches. When I step back and look at these 7 areas together, a pattern becomes obvious. Money should not be defended from all spending. That is not wisdom, that is fear. The goal is not to die with the largest possible account, simply because you treated every dollar like a hostage. The goal is to use money so intelligently that it helps you build a stronger, freer, better protected, more capable life. That means paying for knowledge that compresses time, paying for memories that do not repeat, paying for health that preserves the machine that earns and enjoys, paying for tools that increase productive output, paying for safety, so one bad day cannot erase 10 good years, paying for professionals when ignorance would be vastly more expensive, and paying early for the future through retirement investing. because time is the multiplier that cannot be recreated later. These are not categories where cheapness makes you rich. Very often, cheapness here makes you poorer in more than one dimension. What matters is not lower price, it is higher value. That is what I wish more people understood. Because once you begin asking not how little can I spend, but where does each dollar create the most long-term value, your whole relationship with money changes. You stop acting like a frightened consumer, you start thinking like an allocator, and that is where real wealth, not only in dollars but in life itself, actually begins.